In this video, I'm going to work through problem 6.2 from Gapenski's Healthcare Finance 5th edition. Okay, problem 6.2 is a continuation of 6.1. I know you're waiting with bated breath to learn the fate of the housekeeping dollars here. So we can now assume that the three patient services departments are, we actually have names for them. They're going to be adult services, pediatric services, and other services. And the patient service, so we've got a little table with the department name, the revenue, and housekeeping hours. So I'm going to put a pause on here and write that out. Voila, we're back. All right, so now I have marked up and written down the table that's presented in the text. So the question is, what is the dollar allocation to each patient service department if the patient service revenue is used as the cost driver? Okay, so remember what I said in the first video. You're going to have to ask 4 questions each time. So we're going to work toward how much dollar amount is allocated to each of the service departments. So first, we have to ask, what is our cost pool? Okay, well, the cost pool hasn't changed. It's still $100,000 in housekeeping expenses, right? So 2 is, what is the allocation rate? Sorry, what is the cost driver? Okay, so the first one here is we're going to use patient service revenue. So if we're going to use patient service revenue, it's going to be $5 million in patient service revenue. So what is the allocation rate? The allocation rate is going to be 100,000 in housekeeping expense divided by 5 million PSR, right? So we can cancel this all out, and we get to that, again, that 0.02 like we did last time. Housekeeping dollars, all right, easy for me to say. 2 cents for every $1 of patient service revenue. So you're going to get 2 cents for every $1 of patient service revenue. So the thing to keep in mind here is that 1, 2, and 3 are the same for all 3 departments, right? The cost pool is the same, the cost driver is the same, the allocation rate is the same, right? Getting down to the allocation rate is the same whether if you were asked how much housekeeping would be allocated to other services, right? It's going to use this allocation rate. All 3 departments are going to use this allocation rate. So down to step 3 is, you don't have to do anything different for each of the departments. Then we get to the amount allocated, right? And so the amount allocated is going to vary now depending on how much revenue each of the departments has. So adult services, right, has $3 million in patient service revenue, right, times 2 cents in housekeeping expenses for every $1 of PSR. And I don't have to actually write dollar there, right? Well, I can. For every $1 PSR. So multiplying that through, I get, so that 3 million times 2 cents is 60,000. All right. Let me move up here. I'm gonna run out of space. But pediatric services is 1.5 million PSR times 2 cents in housekeeping for every $1 in PSR, right? So now I get that's 30,000. And then the last one I'll have to start a new sheet here. So, I mean, you don't actually have to do it because you already know. I've got 60 going to adult services, 30 going to pediatric services. So that's 60 plus 30 is 90. Since I know that the total is 100, I know that 10,000 is now going to go to other services because that's what's remaining to be allocated. But I can go ahead and do it just to finish this out. If I can get my sheet to come with me. And so the amount going to other services is going to be $500,000 in PSR times 0.02 housekeeping for every dollar of PSR, right? Which is equal to 10,000. Okay, so that answers A. B is, what is the dollar allocation to each patient services department if the hours of housekeeping support are used as the cost driver? Okay, so we just start over again here. I'm going to, still using this. So now I know, remember, cost pool, I'll abbreviate that. Cost pool is 100,000, right? To cost driver now is going to be 5,000 hours. That's 100,000 in housekeeping expense, 5,000 hours. 3, allocation rate. The allocation rate, right, is the $100,000 in housekeeping expense divided by the cost driver, the 5,000 hours. So we wind up with $20 in housekeeping expense for every hour of housekeeping services, right? And so now we ask amount allocated, and that is actually an individual thing, right? So we're going to start with adult services. Adult services uses 1,500 hours of housekeeping times $20 per hour. So we get 20 times 1,500. That's 15,000. That's 30,000. Pediatric services uses 3,000 hours. So 3,000 hours times $20 per hour gives us 20 times 3 is 3,000 is 60,000. Right? And then finally, other services uses 500 hours times $20 per hour gets us 10,000. And, we didn't really have to do the third one because we knew 30 plus 60 is 90. That leaves 10, and we're still distributing $100,000. So when we add that all up, that's 100,000. So we would have known, okay, other services is going to get the rest, which is 10,000. So part C, what is the difference in allocation to each department between the two drivers? All right, well, it's kind of messy here. Let's see if I can lay this side by side. Yeah. My tape guides are coming up and sticking to my paper. Okay, so using PSR, we wound up allocating 60,000 to adult services and 30,000 to pediatrics and 10,000 to the other. And so across both using either cost driver, other services is getting $10,000. So other services, so if you were the other services manager and your bonus is partly determined partly determined by your P&L, right? So it's partly determined by how much profit you show. And this expense is going to be allocated to you. If you're the manager of other services, you don't really care which way the services are divided up, whether it's by patient service revenue or by housekeeping hours, because the outcome is the same. You get charged $10,000 to your P&L in overhead expenses. But if you're the manager of adult services or pediatric services, you care a whole lot about this, because under so for adult services, under the PSR method, right? Under using PSR as well, this is the direct method. Using PSR as the cost driver, you wind up with $60,000 in expenses. But using the housekeeping hours method, or driver as using housekeeping hours as the driver, you only wind up with $30,000. That could be a big difference in terms of how profitable adult services looks at the end of the year, and the same with pediatric services. So the two managers are going to kind of be looking at this and saying, they're going to have probably some pretty strong opinions about how the expense ought to be allocated. So C just kind of is asking, well, where's the differences? So the difference really is other services, it doesn't matter. Adult services and pediatric services kind of flip-flop between getting 30 or 60, depending on which driver you choose. So part D says, which of the two drivers is better and why? Well, they both work, right? So starting with they both work to allocate the cost pool, which is the $100,000 in housekeeping. The question is, which one is more fair? So the two things you have to deal with as in finance when you're trying to make these kind of calls is one, which one is more fair, more accurately represents how the overhead cost, housekeeping, is actually used, and then what's the cost of calculating it. So using revenue, right? Using patient service revenue, that's something you're going to track no matter what you do. And you're going to know it almost certainly by department. And so you could just kind of use that number without having to do any more work. You don't have to develop any sort of special tracking mechanism to determine the patient service revenue, because you're already by department, because you're probably already doing that. So you can just kind of use that data that you've already gathered, and it saves time and effort. And that's one of the things we have to think about in accounting is time and effort. Like, we can get a lot of information and work with a lot of information that could be interesting, but the question is, as a former colleague of mine used to say, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Is the effort worth the outcome, the additional accuracy of the information? In this case, I would say, it probably is, and it probably wouldn't be that hard to gather the data to do it, to use housekeeping hours by department to allocate the housekeeping cost pool. And I would argue, and I think, the adult services manager would argue, it really is more fair to allocate housekeeping services based on the number of hours that each department uses, because that's actually how housekeeping workload is generated, right? Or the housekeeping cost is generated. It's generated by how many hours your housekeeping staff have to work in any given area. So, I mean, pediatrics, so adult services, if you've got mostly adults, they're, coming in and out, they may occasionally make a bit of a mess. But, my guess is, and I've not actually worked in a pediatric department, but my guess is, pediatrics, you've got kids, they're probably messier. Another way to think about this is like, instead of like comparing adult services to say pediatrics, think about comparing the emergency department to say a family practice unit. And just, if you used patient revenue, um, you might have, I mean, it depends on the organization, but say you might have almost equal revenue coming in to two departments. But I mean, an emergency department is going to be way messier than an outpatient primary care clinic or family medicine clinic, right? And so if you used revenue to allocate the cost, that would be really unfair to the primary care department and would create a situation where the primary care department is really subsidizing the emergency department's P&L. Right. So I would say, which of the two of these is better? I would say probably housekeeping hours. It's certainly more accurate in terms of allocating the actual cost based on how it's generated. And I would say probably in the scheme of things, it's not that much more effort to capture that information. It's probably information that would be relatively easily captured. So I would say housekeeping hours would be the better of the two drivers. That's a long answer to a relatively simple question. All right. And that's the end of that one.